and two very special speakers that we have here today. I'm Shakila Dada, for those of you who don't know me, the current director of the Center for Augmentative and Alternative Communication, and we are very pleased to have our first hybrid conference. We've got people joining us on YouTube as well, so we welcome them as well. All of you that have taken time out of your vacation, for many of you to be here and to participate in today's workshop. We've got two excellent speakers for the day. We are very excited to listen to their presentations. We're going to start off with Professor Sarah Douglas from Michigan State University. I'm going to keep it very brief. The program has her biography, so you can know more about the work she does and the excellent lab that she runs at the university. And today we're going to just listen a lot more about the work that she's doing, the intervention studies that she's been doing. And please feel free to put up your hand and ask a question. It's going to be very interactive and very dynamic. I think it's going to be an exciting day. And for those of you joining us virtually, please use the comment section. Ms. Rushda Hartley is manning it for us. So if there are any questions, she can relay them to our speakers so that you don't feel like you are not part of this exciting webinar today. So welcome everybody and enjoy the day.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that welcome. I'm very excited to be here today and talk about this important topic. I hope all of you are excited to learn a little bit more about providing culturally responsive practices to support children with disabilities and complex needs. As I go through, you'll learn a little bit more about me, but just to give you a little snippet to start, I am an associate professor at Michigan State University. That means I'm tenured. I know the process here maybe looks a little different. And I've been there for about 7 years. The lab that I run, which you'll see RAD, stands for Research in Autism and Developmental Disabilities. And my lab's focus is really on supporting children with disabilities, their education, their families, and their educational teams. And so you'll see that reflected in the things that I'll speak about today, my experiences both professionally before I entered academia and also within academia and research. And you'll see kind of how that has influenced what I'll talk about today. So I just want to start out emphasizing that children with disabilities exist in all cultures, all contexts. There's not a group that doesn't have or experience children with disabilities. Yet there's not much research to really understand the experiences or what we need to do differently in different cultural contexts. Traditionally, the work around children with disabilities, especially those who might have autism, has been around families who have means to go and seek intervention and support for their children. In the US, that's typically white middle-class families. And not necessarily intentionally, but what has sort of happened in the literature and in the field is those individuals have sort of shaped our interventions. So we've created interventions for families who are able to access interventions. But what we really want is for interventions to exist to support all children, to support families who have difficulty accessing intervention, to find families who may not traditionally have sought intervention or support for their children, and provide the supports that are necessary. So I think that's why this topic is so important to me, and kind of my route through life has led me to this space. I've been able to work in a variety of different spaces that has helped me understand why this is so important. We know, like I've said, that there's this cultural gap, and so this work is trying to fill that cultural gap to figure out how can we best provide services and supports to all children, not just the children who traditionally have been seeking these services or the families who traditionally have been seeking these services. We want it for all children, for all families. But you might be asking yourself, what on earth is a white woman from the US have to tell me about culturally responsive practice? And to be honest, it's a very good question. I felt a little nervous about doing this. I'm like, I'm gonna go to South Africa and I'm gonna tell people how to provide culturally responsive practice. This feels a little inappropriate. But I will just say I've had a lot of different experiences in my life that have led me to this point in my career. And those experiences have shaped how I viewed this And so I hope that I can share with you today the things that I've learned as you go along your journey. So I'm not here to say that I know everything. I certainly don't. I'm at the very beginnings of learning what the world could look like if we were to provide culturally responsive practices to all children and families. So I'll start with my first teachers. These are my students that I taught as a teacher in Flagstaff, Arizona. It's really close to the Grand Canyon, if you're like, I have no idea where that is. And I taught a very diverse group of students. Most of my students had very limited verbal skills. Many of them were bilingual learners, which is complicated because if you don't speak, it's hard for people to recognize that you're bilingual, but many of them spoke different languages in their home, understood more than one language. Some were adopted from different countries, and many of them experienced lots of challenges in life. And so as a teacher, I had to learn how to interface with all these different types of cultures and figure out how to best support these students, and included students from Hispanic backgrounds, from African American backgrounds, from different Native American tribes. So you'll see, some students represented that actually represented multiple different tribes, and each tribe works a little bit differently. It was a very bumpy road. I did not do a great job at every point. Thankfully, the families and children I worked with were very forgiving and allowed me to learn as I went. And because of how diverse my students were, I went back to school almost immediately after beginning teaching and got what's called an English Language Learner Endorsement. And that's basically to be certified as a teacher to support children who are learning English as their second language. And while the techniques were very similar to working with children who had limited communication skills, it really helped me understand the perspective that these children might be coming from and better interface with their families, and also learn about the cultural differences that maybe I wasn't picking up on. So as I went into academia, I continued to work with very diverse groups. These are just 4 of the students I've worked with. One of the students is from Indonesia. She's actually a sibling of a young man with autism. So she grew up in that context, learning about all the different services that were not available to her brother, in so much that her mom started a whole school to support children with disabilities so that he would have what he needed in his own country. Prince, he's from Ghana. He is a first-year student, and he started a center for child development in Ghana to help support children with disabilities and their families, and outreach to help them learn how to access services and make services more available. So he's here, or he's not here. He's in the US, learning about what he can do and how he can bring that back to his own country. He's very, very interested in culturally responsive practices and taking what we know as evidence-based practices and making it work in his cultural context. Next is Tian Tian. Tian Tian is from China, and she is very interested about how we can take what we've learned in the US, apply it to different cultural contexts, as well as those individuals who have immigrated from China to other countries, how we can work on bilingual type systems for children who have complex communication needs. She's also really interested in assessment and how we can have better assessments to learn what children with complex communication needs need. And then the last person is Oswald. He's from Malaysia, and he's actually really interested, he's not in my own department, I was an outside mentor to him, but he's interested in providing accessible spaces for recreation purposes for people with disabilities. So I learned a lot about those experiences in his cultural context. And from each of these interactions, and when you work with someone at the doctoral level, you're working with them usually for 4 to 5 years in the US, I've been able to learn a lot about what does it mean for you to take what you're learning here to your context. And then I've also had some really, really great interactions with excellent researchers from many different areas of the world, some who are now working in the US, and been able to implement a variety of different types of projects that really focus on these issues. And I'll talk a little bit more about this at the end of the presentation, but these are some of the people that I've worked with that have kind of shaped how I think about these things as well. I also work with people from a lot of different types of disciplines. So people from nursing, people from couple and family therapy, people from applied behavioral analysis, people from speech, people from education, from early childhood. All of those different viewpoints have also helped me think about things in very creative ways. So really all of this has helped me figure out, how do we do this? Okay, so before we go too far, I wanted to define a few terms. Unfortunately, this field is peppered with lots of terms. And while sometimes they might seem like synonyms, I'm going to try to kind of spell it out to you. I'll use some of these today, but I wanted to kind of give you an introduction. So if this is not a field that's of your area of knowledge, that you kind of know how to navigate these terms within the literature and as people speak about them. So the first is cultural competence. And this is really your ability to understand or communicate or interact with people across different cultures in a way that demonstrates openness and respect. There's some argument in the field that no one can ever be competent in cultures, right? We're constantly learning and growing. I could fly somewhere else today, and just because I'm competent in another culture does not mean I will be competent there. Or just because I'm competent with one individual in that culture does not mean that I will be competent elsewhere or with another individual in that culture. So there's a lot of disagreement about the use of this term, but I think what it implies is that we can continue to gain knowledge and skills, and it's a continual learning process. So this term is sort of, I don't want to say it's being abandoned, but some people have issue with it. So this is why we often use the term cultural humility. And this is really engaging in continuous self-reflection, which I will make you do today, to become more humble and respectful towards individuals from other backgrounds. I think it's important for all of us to sort of take a step back, think about our own biases, our own perspectives, what we bring to the table, and how that shapes how we interact with others from backgrounds that are different from us. So I really like this term, but it doesn't really represent how we might provide practices. It's more like an individual thing. So I really like cultural responsiveness for this reason. It feels like, maybe it's because it's kind of a communicative term, and I'm really interested in communication, but when you're responsive, there's this back and forth, there's this sharing of ideas. So really, the idea is that you're learning and relating respectfully to people in your own culture, but also people in other cultures. And there's this sort of back and forth give and take of ideas and exchange of information. And that, again, sort of implies that you're continually learning. If you're responsive, you're not static. There's always this back and forth. And a term that I just learned recently that's kind of emerging in the field is called culturally affirming. And I love this one. I think it's amazing because it really implies that we're moving away from a Eurocentric view of culture toward approaches that will suit the individuals in the context that they're in. So I'm not coming in with my own biases from my white privilege. I'm saying, tell me what it looks like in your context and making adaptations that will work for them. So I think, when I think of culturally responsive practices, I think of this concept, but I really like the idea of culturally affirming, that the individual for whom you're working on adaptations for feels validated in their own cultural identity and doesn't feel like they're having to change their identity to fit whatever practice that you're engaging in. And then this term I think is really critical when we're talking about people with disabilities. But I think it's true for many individuals, this idea of intersectionality, that all of the different unique experiences that we have, and anything that could lead to oppression, things like gender, race, class, sexual orientation, or disability, work and make like a weave of your own personal identity, your own personal experience. And today when we engage in a cultural self-study, you will have the opportunity to kind of see your own intersections. Sometimes I think it's easy to say, oh, well, my main identity is X. But your main identity is still peppered with other identities. No one just identifies as one single thing. So I'm going to talk about how we can become culturally responsive. And I'm kind of using this particular model. I'm going to go about it in a slightly different way. But this is called the CAP model from Lindo and Lim. I think it's helpful. I like that it has kind of ideas of things to think about. But we're going to dive into cultural self-study pretty deep today. we're going to talk about how you can acquire that cultural knowledge. And then I'm going to give you things that you could do to put this into practice. So before you can really understand others who have backgrounds that are different from your own, you really have to understand your very own beliefs, your own culture, your own identity, and recognize how this influences your beliefs. I love when I talk about this topic to a primarily white audience in the US. They're like, but I don't have a culture. Okay, let's think about that for a moment. I will show you, you have a culture. Today you will leave learning you have a culture. Everyone has a culture. What is your culture? So that's what we're going to dive in today. So we're going to look at some different tools that can help you with a self-study. And I've selected one I think is most appropriate for today, but I'm going to share another one with you that you might want to dive into on your own later. I find it a little clunky for the purposes of today. So this is called a cultural identity map. And as you can see, even with the big screen, there's a lot going on there, right? There's a lot of different questions. I think this is a great addition to the way we're going to look at it today, because there's some things that we're not going to touch on here that I do think really do feed into your identity and your culture. So we're going to use instead the addressing model. And this is what I actually used many years ago when I was teaching at Penn State. I was working with students, and the class was called Children with, I think it was English Language Learners with Disabilities. So we're trying to teach them, how are you going to work with students with disabilities that also have this, language difference? Because that's just not really well accepted or understood in the US. It's like, we speak English, everyone speaks English. Well, that's just not true. And I like this model because it kind of goes through category by category, because they're obsessed with mnemonics, similar to me, as you'll see in this presentation, and maybe why I gravitate towards this one. I've actually grouped some together because I think about those things collectively. So I don't think it's great to go through this one linearly, so we're not going to do that. But in order to help remember the model, addressing each of these things, build that model, with their first letter. So we'll start with thinking about what is your identity. So if you have a piece of paper, I'd like you to pull that out, to take some notes about each of the categories as we go through. Do you need a paper?
I have a slide with all my stuff on it.
Okay, so the first is age. So I want you to think about, how does your age, when you were born, the generation in which you were born, influence who you are? Did you grow up with technology always in your life? Did you grow up during a particular hardship in time? So I know for some family members that I have, they were raised by people who were part of the Depression. That absolutely shaped who they are. Did you experience different things because of the time period in which you were born? So think about how your age influences who you are and how it shapes you thinking in the world. And take just a couple minutes. And I should just state, when we're done with this exercise, I'm going to share all of my categories. I'm going to put it all out there. Also, I'm not really shy. And I'm pretty much an open book. You start getting me talking, you'll learn about goats and all kinds of strange things really quickly. But I'd also like you to think about one thing you might want to share just with someone next to you. I know it's very personal. You might feel a little nervous about that, so pick carefully what you're comfortable sharing. And there's definitely categories that might feel a lot less vulnerable to share than others. I think for some, age might be one of those. So be thinking about what you're comfortable sharing, and we'll get to that. Okay, did everyone have a chance to jot down what they think about age? Okay. All right, next is disability. Think about any disabilities you might have, whether visual or non-visual, so those invisible versus visible disabilities. Think about your interactions with people with disabilities. Did you grow up in a home with someone who had a disability? Were you interfacing frequently with people with disabilities? What's your level of comfort related to disability? Are you more accepting of some disabilities than others? Are you able to accept others' disabilities, but maybe not your own? So just jot down some of your ideas, your thoughts. Okay, I can see the pen writing just dying down a little. You still have a few things to jot down. Go ahead and finish that up. The next is religion or your spiritual orientation. Now, I've been in places sometimes where people say, but I don't have religion. I'm not spiritual. I'm atheist. That still shapes you. Your beliefs about not believing in spiritual things shape you. So think about the experiences you've had in faith communities, in religious groups, your own spiritual connection, how you feel about God or don't feel about God, and how that shapes who you are as a person, and how that might influence how you feel about others who have different beliefs spiritually from you. Again, I'm seeing the scribbles dying down, so I'll move on to the next one. If you still have a few things you want to jot down, please feel free to keep doing that. The next is your ethnicity, your Indigenous heritage, your race. How has that shaped you? What identities in this area do you connect with? Do you have more than one ethnic or racial or Indigenous group that you identify with? What were your experiences as you were growing with people outside of your own racial, ethnic group? And again, sometimes when I present this to a primarily white audience in the US, they're like, well, I don't have a race or ethnicity. But your absence of that has shaped how you might think about or understand others' experiences in this area. Still have a few things you're thinking about, feel free to wrap that up. The next is social class. And I think at first when I saw this one, I was like, what does that matter? But that's because I was raised in a middle class area, you know, like that was my experience. It continues to be my experience. And so a lot of people will think, well, that's like the normal, right? I'm kind of in the middle, but it shapes you. So in this area, I want you to think about what social class did you grow up in? Did you have access to things like education, healthcare, food? You know, were there any things that you wanted for? Did you have a hard time connecting with people who had more or less than you? Did your social class change during childhood or as you entered adulthood? Did it become higher or lower? And how has that shaped you? Right, the next one is sexual orientation and gender. And again, I like to think of these together I think that it's difficult sometimes to separate these, but it could even be your gender identity, your gender expression, your biological sex, your sexual orientation. How has your experience in this space shaped how you view others who have different experiences? Now, there's a lot more comfort about talking about these topics, but if you fell into a minority group for sexual orientation or gender, and now it's more accepted, like how did that influence how you feel about yourself, your experiences, those who interface around you? Just take a minute to write down your thoughts. All right, and then your national origin. Hopefully this is an easy one. Think about where your national origin, where you came from, and maybe you didn't stay in that place. Maybe you obtained citizenship elsewhere. How did that shape you? I used to think, oh, well, I'm from the US, like there's nothing really to that. And then I started interfacing with people from different cultures, even within the US, and I realized, wow, we have some very specific beliefs and a cultural system that is very unusual to other people. We value independence. We value going it alone, right? The collective group effort is not something that's really, whenever they do group projects in the US, everyone's like, oh, I hate this. And it shaped who I am, maybe in sometimes negative ways. So think about how that looked for you, how that looks for you, and how that's influenced who you are. Okay, so I want you just to look collectively through your list right now. And as I talk about my own identity, I want you just to think about what you're going to be willing to share with a partner. We'll do a share with a partner, then anyone wants to share out to the audience. I think it's great to sort of hear the viewpoints of others and how those different perspectives, they might be like, oh, I just didn't think of that, and how that shaped who you are. So my identity, to be honest, when I was doing this the first time, I thought, well, this is all a little boring. Like, I am a white, middle-class woman from the US. Like, there's not really much to tell in my story. But as I kind of dove in, I learned a lot. So first, my age. I am a Zennial. People are like, what on earth is that? It's the weird little generation between Generation X and millennials. They forget about us all the time. We're like the forgotten middle child. But I grew up knowing technology from a pretty young age. I remember the first report I ever wrote, I used my mom's typewriter. And then later, when I was in like middle school, we got our first computer. And I remember the sound of the modem dial-up, right? Do you guys know that sound? Okay, yeah, it feels when I hear that, my kids are like, what is that terrible noise? I'm like, that is the internet. It's a beautiful noise. Like, you didn't even know the internet never existed. It has always existed for you. I remember the first computers in computer labs in school, and we would play this game called Oregon Trail, and people would constantly die from diseases that we'd never heard of in the US, but apparently still exist today. I remember the change in how music formats came. So we have records, and then we have very short period, 8 tracks, which I don't think really existed in my generation, but I knew of them because my friend had one in her RV, and I was like, what is this crazy contraption? And then we moved to cassette tapes, and we could make mixtapes and put our favorite things in. Wait till the song came on the radio and press record, and you finally get that song, and you're so excited. And then we went to CDs, and it's like, don't scratch my CD. Cassettes never did this. And then we went to MP3s, and I'm like, well, hallelujah, we can keep this. And then it's like, what, we can stream music? That's a lot of change in one lifetime. And it keeps happening. But I grew up in a generation that is accustomed to those changes. So I like to think I'm quite flexible. I can learn new technologies, even if they frighten me at first. And I'm pretty understanding of that. But my generation is very much shaped by the mass, crazy technological changes. Probably why I got super interested in assistive technology and AAC, to be honest. Disability, when I think about this one, I was like, I grew up in spaces where children with disabilities were accepted and loved. It was not seen as a burden. It was not seen as a negative thing. It was honestly seen as a blessing from God. Like those parents were lucky that God thought that they were capable enough to handle this situation. I didn't know that everyone doesn't have this experience. I had no clue, and it absolutely shaped who I was willing to become. Would I have gone and interfaced with children with disabilities in elementary school during recess if I didn't have those first experiences? No, I would have been scared. I recognize that experience and that early acceptance of people with disabilities really did shape me. I even remember my own congregation growing up. There was a young man who had been hit by a drunk driver, and he was drugged by the drunk driver for about a block. He ended up with as a quadriplegic, but when it was time for him to engage in certain ceremonies in our congregation, they adapted the church for him. They made a lift so he could participate fully in everything that he did. And I didn't even think that was weird. I'm sure some of the adults were like, wow, it's cool that we're doing this. I just thought, well, he has to do what he has to do, and we have to make it so he can. Now looking back, I realized, wow, that was kind of forward thinking, but that's what the congregation felt like needed to happen for him. When it came to my own disability later in life, I was not so kind to myself. Sorry, I don't want to cry about this, but it is sensitive, right? We're talking about things that shape who we are as people. So I happened to be the face of depression. Crazy, right? Like, I'm a pretty upbeat person. How could someone who's happy be depressed? Well, I'm also potentially a good actress. Probably not good enough for Broadway, but that has more to do with my voice than anything. And I didn't even realize that I had anxiety until I was in my mid-30s. That's a long time to figure out, like, what is driving your depression. My first experience with depression was when my second child was born, and I spiraled into deep, dark postpartum depression. It was so scary that at the time, my husband asked me a question that still kind of haunts me and makes him seem like a huge jerk, but it is absolutely what I needed to hear. He asked me, at the time, there was probably a few years before, there was a woman in the news who had drowned all of her children. She was in a very bad space, clearly. And he asked me, are you like that woman who drowned all of her children? And I said, I don't know. It was so scary. But I wanted to be healthy. I wanted to do what I needed to for my family, but I was in a very bad place. So thankfully, I was put into contact with great professionals. I bounced right out of that depression pretty fast. It was actually a very beautiful thing. I was able to be a mother. I was able to be a good wife. Oh, I'm sorry. I was able to function better again. And so I thought, I'm done with that piece of my life. Like, that disability that I experienced was just a fleeting thing. It was a fluke. Then I went into academia. And it is a little bit of a rough world. And tenure track is very, very, very stressful. And who would have thought that also being a mom of 3 children and a wife and all of those other things would be supportive of that? It was a little challenging. And so I had to seek help again. And that's when I learned that I have anxiety, which for me looks like perfectionism. I want to do everything perfect every time. Well, I don't know a single mom who feels like she's doing a perfect job. And I had 3 kids, so I felt like I was failing each of them. I was trying to get tenure, so I had to give my all to that. And I just didn't feel good about my situation. I will just say that even though today I don't necessarily think of myself as an anxious or depressed person, this experience shaped who I am. It has made me so much more understanding to people who are having trouble showing up, who are just don't have their act together. I have been there. I've tried to have my act together and just not been able to make it work. But I know that that experience has shaped who I am and has really influenced me. Okay, next is religion or spiritual orientation. Again, I thought, I don't know that I have a ton to contribute here, but as I thought about my spiritual orientation, my religion, I actually have a lot to contribute. So I belong to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And many of you might say, I have no idea what that means. It's a Christian religion. But one of the things that is very true to our history is this idea of being oppressed and being asked to flee for religious freedom multiple times. So in the US, when this religious group was forming, there were actually extermination orders on record to kill anyone who was in this religion. So they kept moving and moving and moving. I have records of family members who engaged in different expeditions related to this movement west, who boiled their shoe leather to eat. And so whenever I think to myself, wow, this is really hard, my mom's voice comes in my head and says, you are made from pioneer stock. You don't give up. They didn't give up. You're here because they didn't give up. They kept going and they kept going and they kept going. So it shaped me more than I kind of realized in my youth and has helped me figure out who I want to be today. My ethnicity and Indigenous heritage, again, you might be saying, well, I don't have one if you're white. And I don't, but I recognize that even though I might have experienced some pieces of oppression in these other aspects, my white privilege is a buffer to that. My experience as a white woman is a buffer to that. Okay, continuing. My gender and sexual orientation, again, it's like I'm a straight female. Like, what does that really contribute? But it shaped who I was. I always wanted to be a mom. I always wanted to get married and have a family. And that's probably the biggest part of my identity that I think about on a day-to-day basis. This is who I am. I'm a mom. I'm a wife. Like, I like my husband so much that I refer to him as husband, not in a derogatory term. And people are like, why do you call him husband? He calls me wife. I don't know. We like each other. Like, we're happy about that relationship. We find pride in that. Social class. I always pictured myself, and this is going to feel very American, in that white picket fence, that cute little house. My best friend and I growing up, we used to dream about folding laundry on a front porch together when we grew up with all of our children running around and playing. It's a very, Trina is so embarrassed for me. I'm sorry, that's really what I dreamed about. I thought that would be fantastic. Now I'm like, can someone else do my laundry for me? But at the time, that's what I thought was going to be a really cool dream for myself. So that really did shape who I am as well. And I've always had the luxury of knowing I will be a homeowner, having to experience that and experience it multiple times, even though it's sometimes terrible because you have to take care of your own things when they break. And of course, my national origin, I talked about this a little bit. Americans are fiercely independent. We don't like people to tell us what to do. We want to go our own way. We want to forge our own path. We can make anything of ourselves. And I thought, it shaped me. It absolutely shaped me. So I want you to think again of what you'd like to share. Just turn to the person next to you and share. Or if there's like three of you clustered together, share one thing that you'd like to share. And then I'll ask if anyone wants to kind of share out to the group. I'll give you just a couple minutes. All right, I'm hearing lots of good conversation, so I'll give you another minute or so to wrap it up. But I'm guessing you're just making friends too. All right, I'm paying attention to time, and I tend to be chatty, so let's come back together. We'll come back together, and I wonder if there's anyone that shared something that they feel comfortable sharing with the rest of the group. Again, I recognize some of this is very personal, and you might feel very vulnerable sharing that, so don't if you don't want to. Yeah, Candace, you have something?
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind sharing.
Here, I'll come closer. I know the audience online can't hear me, or see me, but then they can hear.
So I think I'm also a decennial. But I think the thing that bothers me when I look back at my age and when I grew up is that I grew up during apartheid and I didn't know it. I grew up very poor, not privileged, often without food or a place to live, but I did not know that I was growing up in apartheid. And I went on with my life completely unaware. And now I'm starting to curse, and I actually feel guilt about that I grew up oblivious to what was going on right now.
It's not your fault, though, right?
No, it's not my
But
fault.
it's part of your experience, and so it shapes.
Yes, so nowadays, the way I relate to people, even though, as I say, I was unaware, it kind of, it definitely shapes how I relate to people. That even though I was obliviously part of the problem, I am not the problem.
Right.
And I want you to know that.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. Anyone? Oh, yes. Okay, I'm going to come up to you so that people can hear you on the microphone online. All right, what's your name? Shabira. Okay.
I grew up in the heart of art, so that really influenced my thinking. I grew up in a family of activists, and to date, I still think that way. It influences my thinking about myself. And my spirituality and my religion, which is Islam, has obviously helped me to cope with this. The understanding of also understanding in Islam. And so obviously music was the Beatles and Tom Jones and England Company.
Some of us still listen to us.
The youngsters still listen to them.
Yes. It comes back.
Yeah. And so that really influenced my partner. She also grew up as a Christian and influenced her behavior, and she's a
Yes, Constance, do you want me to read what you wrote? Okay, Constance says that she grew up accepting other person's disabilities, but not her own. Yeah, relatable to me for sure. And she grew up going to church, and now she's found her spiritual beliefs, and she's a religious person in spirit. Her social class growing up was active. She didn't lack much until her disability, but now it's back to when she was young. you kind of experience that ebb and flow a little bit. And she got to understand, as far as her national identity, she got to understand different cultures and beliefs that were different in so many ways. Thank you. All right, maybe one more. You can follow all of those. Okay, great. All right, and this is Marguerite. Okay.
What's interesting is, and you can see what I wrote down here, when you mentioned disability, I said not much interference with disability. And when you started speaking, I was just mentioning to her, I also have 2 children, and my youngest is 10 months and the other one is 4. And I also struggled with postpartum anxiety and perfectionism, and I didn't even think about the fact that that was a disability until you mentioned it. And then I thought, wow, you know, I can actually.
Isn't that just being a good mom, right? Just being like so neurotic that you want to be perfect all the time?
Yeah, I didn't even realize.
Good. So you got to think about something that hadn't been in your awareness before.
Yeah.
Good. Okay. All right. I know many of you might have more to share, but we will have a break at some point, so maybe we can talk then. But I kind of want to go on to the next piece. I want to talk about some of the lessons I've learned as I've tried hard to engage in culturally responsive practices. The first one is that my values do not necessarily equal your values. So I worked with a student, his name is Oscar. Oscar had cerebral palsy. I say had, it's just because he's an adult now and I'm thinking of him as a child. He's still around. He has cerebral palsy. He is Hispanic. And I remember preparing for an IEP meeting. This is like the educational team meetings that we have in the US that plans what we're going to do educationally for children with disabilities. And we were preparing for this, and all of us felt very strongly that we should help Oscar become potty trained. We wanted him to be accepted by his peers, to experience less stigma. And sure, he had cerebral palsy. He may not be able to have the sensations that would help him know if he needs to go to the bathroom, but we could put him on a schedule and we knew he would be successful. We felt very good about this. So we go into that meeting and we're like, hey, Mom and Dad, we have a great idea. We'd like to potty train Oscar. And Mom's like, no. Excuse me? You don't want to potty train your kid? And she's like, no. And I was like, can you explain? At least I did that part, right? Like, you know, my very like egocentric and independent like viewpoint was clearly coming out. But I was like, I want to understand I can't figure out why you wouldn't want to do this. And she said, it is my joy and my pleasure to care for my son for his whole life. I don't mind changing his diaper. And I was like, well, wow, what do you say to that? And so we said, okay, and just kind of vowed as a team, we'll bring it up and see if she changes her mind later.
Yeah.
And I think at the time I was like, she'll change her mind. He's going to get bigger. It's going to be harder. She won't want to do this forever. I really don't know if she changed her mind. But at that moment in time, I was like, wow, my values aren't the same as hers. And that's not wrong, right? But it was something I had to accept. That kind of feeds into the next one. The priorities of the family need to be our focus. We cannot take what we want for children with disabilities and cram it down the throats of families of children with disabilities. They know their children the best. They know what their children need. We might think potty training is number 1 on my list. That sounds like a terrible thing to do for your whole life. It's very expensive to buy diapers, right? But if that's not number 1 on their list, then it's not worth pursuing. Go with what's important to them. What do you want for Oscar? What do you hope for him? What are your dreams for him? I was working with a family who had come from Egypt, and they were coming because the father was seeking a PhD. And when they got there, their child was very young when they arrived. They had some older children. They realized that their son had autism, sought a diagnosis for him, all of these things. And when they were first in the US, they still spoke Arabic as a family to all of the children. The older 2 were fluent in Arabic. As soon as they figured out their son had autism, they said, we can't do Arabic. That's going to be too hard for him. We have to do English. I was sort of like sad when she told me that. I was like, no, he needs his language. It's not fair that all of you have conversations that he's never going to understand. But again, I had to realize her priority. She also said to me, we can't go back to Egypt. There's nothing for him. He will get nothing. We have to figure out a way for my husband to stay here in the US so my son can have what he needs. So it's like, okay, they're not focused on Arabic, but they're focused on getting their son everything he needs. How can I make that happen for them? So really sort of re-emphasize that I've got to think about what they care about. Sure, I can share with them potentially, like, it's really valuable for children to have their home language. Here's reasons why. But I'm not going to change her mind in one conversation. She's made this choice because she thinks it's best for her child. It's not wrong. It's just different than what I think. I think the other one is to be careful not to make broad generalizations. The story that goes with this one is a little wacky, I'm going to admit. And you might be like, I have no idea what culture you're talking about. But when I was at Penn State, I was told a story about a man who had an acquired brain injury. I think it was from a horse accident, who's part of this community called the Amish. Has anyone ever heard of the Amish? Okay. And you're probably like, it was some romance novel that I found, and it was very weird, but also kind of old-fashioned, right? That's something, like there's a lot of Amish novels at US libraries. It's a little bizarre. But the Amish are a community who don't believe in electricity, who don't believe in automobiles, technology. They believe in living the old life, a simple life. Their clothes are very simple. If you're actually Amish, you wear only black, dark blue, or white. The women all wear dresses. They wear caps. They don't cut their hair. It's very traditional. And this man came into the clinic and said, I guess he didn't say, he communicated that he needed a way to talk to people in his community. And the first thing that they went to, knowing this community pretty well in Pennsylvania, they decided, we're gonna go for paper-based. There's no way technology is gonna work for him. And they kept showing him paper-based after paper-based, and they're doing the evaluation. They're like, hey, try this, And he's like, well, what about that? What about this? And he kept going towards the technology. And they're like, but will your community allow you to use technology? And he just kept saying, but I can say what I want to say with this technology. I can't do what I want to do with these other paper-based systems. I do think some paper-based systems have come a long way since then. But he left that day with a computerized system. He took it back to his community, tried to talk to them, and they thought he had a demon. They were like, we will not talk to you. That's a demon speaking to us. We will not communicate. So he ended up going back and said, you know what? It's not going to work. He was so hopeful. And I think this is one of those examples. We make these broad generalizations. Well, he can't use technology because he's Amish. And so then they were like, well, we got to go back. But sometimes those generalizations might still be true for the broader culture. Yeah, that technology worked great for him. But he's not going to be just communicating with, as they call it, English. He wants to communicate with the Amish. He wants to be with his people, and he couldn't do that with the technology that had been provided. Have high expectations. I think those who are usually in this field do this quite well, but I think it's easy to sort of step back sometimes and say, man, I really just didn't think this kid could do this. Or maybe your expectations are tainted by the cultural group that this child is part of. Really check yourself, your biases, and figure out, do I really have the highest expectations that I can for this child? Do I believe that they can go here when others don't? And then work towards that. Again, keeping in mind the ideas and goals of the family, what they're hoping for their child, but always maintaining those high expectations. And then continue to learn and to improve. This is not a static process. It's dynamic. You're going to continue to learn. And today, it's been a pleasure, and I hope some of you will come up and chat with me after.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Sarah. I think everybody must have learned something new today, and thank you for making it so practical and applied in a sense. And I know it's sometimes harder to do that, to make things that people can interact and engage with it. So thank you very much for some of those ideas. I think we must also, Sarah, acknowledge the Alliance of African Partnerships.
Yes,
Our funders, just the funders who actually granted the funding for this particular project and allowed for Sarah to come and visit us at the center. And of course, Sarah, we've got the group that's going. So we have your emails, or if you would like to join the larger group that's actually working on the project, you're more than welcome to perhaps email Sarah or I. We do plan to have more online lectures between our groups talking about this particular aspect of our work. So you're more than welcome to join that. I know some of our students are part of the group, but of course we open the invitation to others who would like to be part of it. Just drop us an email and we can then invite you to those groups and you can join some more of those online discussions. I think the rest of it will be done online for the next at least year or so. So thank you very much, Sarah, for that very interesting talk. I think I'm going to just allow maybe a moment or two to get questions because I don't think people will mind. I'm sure they would rather ask a question than have tea at this point. So please, are there any questions or comments for Sarah? Many of you doing interventions, I know. When I spoke to some people, they're doing interventions in different contexts. Any comments about how some of this might facilitate some of your thinking or something that perhaps Sarah can think about? Don't be shy. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, should we get the mic?
I'm surprised that this is quiet.
Yes.
Because we are working in the same area, we are educators,
Yes.
and we are in the locations, and our children suffers the most.
Right.
Because we are not aware of this autism, the severe disabilities. So after we had our first visual class, she was like, we need to open our center here in Katlehong so that different schools with disabilities can come here and we teach them how to interact with our children. So that's our dream, to open our own center.
Good luck with that.
Awesome, thank you. I think what kind of was really, the presentation was wonderful, thank you, in its affirmation of this idea of really just connecting with caregivers. I'm a speech language therapist by profession, and I think one of my big conflicts in practice is the traditional model of needing to do this direct intervention with children and my natural desire to empower and equip caregivers and really kind of focusing what I do on that skills transfer to them so they can do it at home. And so I think that was wonderfully encouraging for me to really sort of see that I'm haunted by feedback that I got as a student more than 20 years ago, that my therapeutic style is too didactic because I love sharing the background and the understanding, and so I think what I really took away from your presentation is just this idea of needing to connect with that whole system that the child exists in and equipping them to take that communication further. So thank you for
Right, and just the impact that you can have when it's not just you coming in and doing intervention for, I don't know what it is here, but in the US it's like, your SLP might, SLT, you say SLP, yeah, might come in for 30 minutes twice a week. Well, an hour a week is not going to change that child's communication. You're going to make such small progress, but if you can empower and give the parent tools, think of how far that child. So I'm glad that I could encourage you to ignore that poor advice that you got as a student. Okay.
I was really so inspired by listening to some of the presentations, especially that since I think how we think about introducing interactive settings where they don't really happen, and
also on the part of sustaining, how can we make intervention sustain on the part of coaching. And the thing that I think about is coming into a family and also giving it in such a way like I'm a therapist or an interventionist, but the reflection part is so interactive. You think about the work that you're doing as an interventionist and also getting feedback from the family as well. So that line is like really cut and becomes whereby I'm giving, and they're also giving to me as well. So I think it's really a very interesting way in terms of how we can approach intervention with the reflection aspect that takes place during the process as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Any other?
Thanks very much, Sarah, and thanks for sharing as well some of your own experiences. I think it made it much easier for us to also
Again,
share
I
that
apologize if my
experience.
oversharing skills
Not at
make
all.
some of you embarrassed, but
Not
that is
at
who I
all.
am, so.
Not at all, but thank you for doing that and feeling safe enough to do so. So let's go and have some tea in the same venue that we had a snack a little while ago. And then we're going to be back here just before 11 so that we can listen to Professor Spencer's presentation. Thank you.
Guess what you were doing? Taking turns telling stories orally. That's what you were doing. I like these girls are noisy over here. I like them. Okay, yes. See, they've done that. They're telling stories, right? And how do you get to know people? Well, you tell stories about this happened to me and oh my goodness, that happened to you too? My turn, I take a turn, then I listen to your story that's similar, right? We tell stories in the hundreds every day, in the hundreds. But guess what? Our kids with disabilities, they don't know how to do this. They can't even tell their parents what happened at school that day. The kid comes home with a scratch on their face, mom's what? Gone crazy because they don't know what happened to their child, right? A good communication book like Sarah described would be helpful, but wouldn't it be great if that child could actually tell mom, like I tripped, I hit the slide, something like that, got a scratch. And actually research suggests that that's the number one request of parents of children with disabilities. I just want my child to tell me what happened at school. Yeah, pretty powerful. Okay, where was I? Oh, culturally relevant. Like, I loved Sarah's presentation because I could do this same presentation from that cultural lens, but I'm just gonna give you a bullet point. The reason why storytelling is so powerful is it crosses cultures. Every culture tells stories. And in fact, linguists, when they study languages, they use the culture's storytelling to learn about that language. Right? It's very powerful. Cultures have their own styles, their own purposes, and we can make a story relevant to this child from this culture and this child from the different one. And the children can be talking about stories that it's relevant to them from their own culture. They're incredibly useful. We use stories in school. We use storytelling for like assessment purposes, for intervention purposes, instruction purposes, as well as social skills. They're ubiquitous. I already mentioned they're totally and completely ubiquitous in our lives. We tell stories all day long. I don't think anybody was counting how many stories that Sarah told, but she told like almost 100. Like I would say, if I had been collecting data, which I thought about later, I was like, oh, I should have been like tallying. But she told us so many stories, right? Everywhere. And the reason why the stories are so powerful is because they are sense-making devices. She used them to help you understand her points, to illustrate it, right? Because she was giving you bulleted list of facts, but she followed it up with a story to help you make sense of those facts. The story is far more powerful than any list of facts or any exposition is what we'd call that, or information. All right, so oral storytelling is also very socially important. Like most of what I'm talking about is academic stuff, but think about what happens in a social exchange when we're talking about oral storytelling. And this woman over here works with kids with autism, right? Think about your kids with autism and how much they need these things, right? Eye contact. You have to listen. You have to attend to your speaker, okay? You have to take turns, right? It's inappropriate for me to just tell one story after another, after another, after another, right? I want to hear from you, and then I'm going to tell you a story, and then this one's going to tell a story. We take turns. Theory of mind, like the idea that you have to kind of put yourself in somebody else's position to figure out what is your listener understanding right now, right? If your listener is like, wait, like has this look on their face, like what's going on? Then the speaker knows, oh, actually they're not getting something. I didn't do it right. I need to try again. Let me go back and explain, right? And you add in a piece. Emotions. Do you know, actually conveying emotion is one of the primary purposes of a story. Not always do stories explicitly include an emotion, but it can be inferred from, I think I'm just not moving it along. Anyway, so the emotions, and we can teach emotions through it, right? Are you okay if I keep using you as a reference?
Sure.
All right. So I don't know if you guys noticed, but when Sarah told the story about her experience with disability, she was emotional. All of you got super quiet and you had empathy for her. You all put yourself in her position and you understand that point. She drove it home with emotion, whether it was intentional or not.
It was embarrassing, but it's fine.
It was powerful, and it's important to acknowledge that had a greater impact on you as a listener, right, than her giving you a list of like strategies to do. You're going to remember that, right? You're going to remember because her emotion spoke to your emotion. Okay. I actually was watching you all during that moment because I was like, yeah, Sarah, right, right? That's the way she cried. Yeah, she was great. She was great. Great performance if you're an actress. It was a terrific performance. I give you an Emmy. All right, problem solving. So as a sense-making device, we use the components and the structure of storytelling to actually solve our problems, right? Stories have problems, they have emotions attached to them, and then they have attempts to solve the problem, and then they have resolutions. That is a problem-solving framework. And protection. Do you know that children who can tell stories about past events are less likely to be abused and neglected? But the reason why children with disabilities are often abused and neglected is because the perpetrators know they can never tell on them. So in my world, in the world by Trina, if everything was dictated by what I believe is right, we would be training children from as young as 2 years old how to tell stories and report on events like abuse and neglect. Because it is a protection against child abuse. It is protection against sexual abuse, right? Bullying, think about it, bullying in schools. Why does bullying continue? Because the victim is too afraid to talk about it. So protection is powerful, right? And this is a right. All children, regardless of their disability, have the right to be protected. Okay, so have I convinced you that oral storytelling is the bomb, right? It's the coolest thing in the world. We need it for literacy. We need it for social interaction. We need it for problem solving and protection. Okay, so let's look really quickly at the difference between narration and exposition. I've already hinted to this a little bit, but the idea here, I use storytelling, not because it's the only thing that we need to do in academic language or in literacy context, but it's the place you start because you can build from there to get to these more challenging structures like informational text, right? So we build metalinguistic skills, and what I mean by metalinguistic skills is it's knowledge about language, right? If we teach kids explicitly about language, then they actually have the tools to apply it in a different context, okay? So the differences between narration and exposition is that narratives or stories are personally and culturally relevant, whereas In exposition, you really need to have background knowledge and understanding of domain-specific vocabulary, right? Have you ever read a scientific paper outside of your area of expertise? It's really hard, right? You're like rereading, oh wait, I have to go to the dictionary to look up this word, right? That's really hard. But stories don't generally have that like domain content that you need a lot of knowledge for. Okay, so it makes that exposition more difficult. So narratives also have a very simple structure pattern, and they're generally formulaic, right? They are consistent in stories. There's only like one set, really, and I'm going to show you in just a couple slides what those structures are. But in exposition, you could have you could have a main idea, deep key details, you could have compare and contrast, a sequence, or a how-to. There's lots of different structures. So stories are also causally and temporally organized, so the related events, and exposition is topically organized. I already told you that we remember stories because of the causal relations. We don't remember a list of facts, right? They're much more difficult. Okay. I think if we're good to go forward, then the next phase of this, actually for the most of the rest of the presentation, I'm going to be talking about 10 principles for narrative intervention, and it's based on this paper. Today, I'm only going to be giving you a teaser of what these 10 principles are. I don't have time to go into the details of it. But if you are interested, this is a paper. It's very easy to read. It's published in a speech language pathology journal, and it is open access, so everyone can get access to it, okay? And it goes into detail about the principles I'm going to be talking about. And it gives you a good tutorial on the things I just did, right? Basically, my intro is also in the intro of the paper. Okay, so here's the principles. I'm just going to get into it. First one is build structure first. Okay, so what I mean by the structure, it's that discourse structure. It's kind of like the container of other academic language. We need that. By the way, I forgot to tell you, but I do have a number of video clips that I'm going to be showing you. So I'm not going to be talking the whole time. We're going to get to them quickly. Okay. I'm going to need a break to take a drink as well. But the idea of building the structures first, it's like building the boat before you can float, right? We need to have the boat. So in this way, we need to have the ability to tell a story before we can teach the complex language that's in that story, okay? So one of the most common mistakes for education and clinicians is that they do not continue to build like word and sentence level structures after the narrative like discourse structure is built, right? So once you build the boat, then you need oars, you need crew, you need a mast, you need a sail, you need all these other things. It's not just this outline of the boat. Okay, so generally speaking, oral language is easier than written language. Retelling a story that you heard or read is easier than generating or making up your own story. Talking about a personal story, one that you've experienced, is easier and generally more amenable to young kids than making up a fictional story. That requires additional repertoires. And then telling stories when there's pictures available is easier than if there's no pictures available. So I'm telling you because there is kind of like a flow. And the flow kind of looks like this. We work on the story structures first, then we can build complex sentences and words within that story, okay? But then once we've got those three things down, we need to generalize into more complex things, okay? Things like generating personal stories, fictional stories, writing, and even moving into exposition. So remember, in the work I do, we start at narratives, but our ultimate goal is to get to writing and to exposition because that's what's most academically necessary in schools. And that's what kids are tested on in schools. Okay, story arc. Have you guys seen this graphic? Anybody? So there is such a thing as story arcs. And, if you read novels, there's a story arc in that novel. Okay, but along the bottom, like if you're talking about young kids, 3 to 5 years old, we usually just talk about the story arc as a beginning, middle, and end. I'm not really satisfied with that because it's like, what is at the beginning? What is in the middle? What is at the end? And the story arc is great, but it has things like exposition, rising action, climax, falling action. All of those are metaphoric. young kids and children with disabilities don't understand those things. These are abstract. This story arc representation is meant for adults, right? And oftentimes we use storytelling in like science communication, like tell the story, of your research, and they use this story arc. But I'm going to teach you the parts of the story and how we would teach it to young kids. Okay, so this would be a character, all right? And I'm going to have you do some gestures with me. We're going to use them later, okay? As I'm introducing this is the character. Everybody put your hand on your head like this. All right, good. So this is the setting. Everyone do this. Excellent. It's the setting. So these are the parts of the exposition. But this is the problem. Everybody, that's a thumb down. Thumbs down, right? Problem. All right, we start to rise because we've got to have some emotion, right? That's our feeling. This is the gesture for feeling. It's like a little tear coming down, okay? All right, this means plan. So the character in the story needs to create a plan so that they can solve that problem that makes them sad or angry or frustrated, okay? Oh, the plan is this. Sorry, I have my gestures like this. Let's think about this. Kids are so cute when they do this. Yeah, right? They're so expressionable. Love it. All right, so what else? Oh, this is an action. An action is an attempt to solve the problem. And the gesture goes like this. It's like a star moving across the sky. Okay, that's our action. Oh, all right, guess what this one is? This one is a consequence or an unresolved problem, meaning that the first attempt to solve the problem did not fix it. Okay? So we do, I gotta have two hands. We do this. Okay? All right. So that means that we still have a problem. Notice the color is red. It's the same color as the problem. Okay, but it's a consequence of the attempt to solve the problem, which was the yellow one. Okay. But guess what? We have another emotion because my problem is not solved. Now I'm just frustrated because I'm putting in this effort to get this problem solved and it's not working. So I've got to come up with a different plan and a different attempt or action. So there's another action. Okay. All right, so we had an emotion, an action. All right, this time, this action works. This is called a consequence or a resolution. Okay, notice it's green. It's the same image as I had for the red one, right? Because it actually worked. It's green. All right. Sorry, this one is like this. All right. Okay. This is an ending. This is what happens after the problem is resolved, right? We just call it an ending for kids. Like, it happens. We're like, oh, good. We're moving on, okay? And then there's an end feeling, which is like this. So I bet you have kids with disabilities on your caseloads or in your schools who could probably engage in those gestures, whether or not they have verbal skills, okay? They can show that they can understand what you're talking about by using the gestures, and they can understand the story arc, all right, based on icons. And remarkably simple, even young kids, like 3-year-olds with disabilities, can learn symbols like these, right? Much like they learn the symbols on an AAC system. Okay. All right, frames. I'm going to teach you about this. Frames are like those structures, right? That story grammar structure that I just talked about, right? They're the fixed structures of language, and they serve like this lattice work, right? So if you imagine like this generative language of words and sentences are all the ivy or the leaves, but they have to have something to grow around, something that's kind of firm and set. That's what that structure is. So the character, setting, problem filling, action, ending, those are structural pieces that give substance to the language. We also call them cognitive schemas. And the reason why they're cognitive is because once those like patterns are learned, they're up here rather than in your linguistic system, and they cross languages. So once you learn the pattern in Spanish, you can apply it in English, and then apply it to Afrikaans, to Sepedi, right? because it's a cognitive application. So this narrative frame, we call this story grammar. It's the rules for ordering and grouping narrative elements, okay? Because there is an order. The words in the sentences are the variable terms. So imagine this, that you have bins and buckets of these pieces, and the terms in them, the words in the sentences, switch out. That's where we get generative language, but we have to give them the structure or the frame to build it in, okay? So there are also sentence frames. Sentence frames are relatively fixed structures. There's many, many options, and the words and the phrases are the variable terms. So let's just look at the character bin. Here's some examples of a character. Once there was a boy named Fred. Do you see the 3 elements? Okay, here's the same 3 elements with some variability, some swapping out. Once there was a horse named Ned, right? And then again, I have the same 3 time element to the left. When I was young, I played a game, and this apposition or this appositive called Ned's head. Okay, so these are just examples of the frames that we have in sentences. So when we teach these patterns or these frames, we actually can get generative language better than if we just teach specific words. If we're teaching them to say, I want cookie please, you're only going to get I want cookie please, right? Unless you have some variability in that frame, right? Or can I have, may I have, right? You need to just change it up. Okay, so these are the story grammar elements, the things that I just showed you, the icons that we use. So a basic structure has a problem, an attempt or action, and a consequence. That's the very core. We call it the plot structure or episodic structure. Notice that when we watch an episode on Netflix, it has those 3 key pieces, right? It's the same when we're watching movies, books, there's episodes. And sometimes you can have multiple episodes if the first attempt to solve the problem doesn't work, which is what is normal in an adult book or movie thing. So you would kind of start in one place, and I'm giving you kind of what's expected at different grades in the US. I don't have any clue what's expected in South Africa. Like, I'll be honest, I have no idea. But we like to start with at least a basic or a complete episode, depending on the age of the child and the abilities of the child. Okay, we're going to take a couple minutes, and I want you to think, right? Think about, are these story structures, or like the pieces, character, setting, problem, feeling, action, ending, are they the same in your culture and in your language? I don't actually know. That's actually why I'm here as a Fulbright scholar. I'm here to learn what are the cultural differences with storytelling in South Africa, right? Because I only have my own frame of reference, but I know from my own research that Spanish-speaking children tell stories slightly differently than English, mainstream, Eurocentric students do in the US. African-American children tell stories differently than your mainstream American kids do. So I would assume that there are some differences, but I really like for you guys to think about this. Okay, so you think about it, you pair up with somebody next to you and take 2 minutes telling each other what you guys think about it. Okay? All right, go. Okay. I know this might be more fun to talk about than listening to me over and over again, but does anybody want to share if you came up with a difference that from the framework I just showed you, and what language or culture that might be in? Did anyone identify any differences? No? Yeah? Tell me.
Yes, we did identify some differences, like mostly in our culture. Our storytelling is more of moral values.
Okay, moral values.
And most of the time, some of them have regulations about which you have to believe to like it or not. So it's something like that. But when you go to the English stories, they are more about the vocabulary. Other than if you can swim, you must not leave the belt on the door. Okay. You must not. So they're nearly the same, but in our culture, it's more about discipline.
Yes.
Other than vocabulary.
Very good. Thank you so much for sharing that. So she's pointing out that in her culture, the stories, the purpose of storytelling, is to transmit knowledge to children about that culture, right? What are the values of that community? What are the morals that they want to instill, and they use it for discipline, right? That is. There are cultures in the U.S. that also use it for those purposes, like our American Indian cultures. They use a lot of oral storytelling to manage behavior, right? So I'm going to tell you a quick story about how I use storytelling to manage my children's behavior, because I learned from the American Indians, hey, this is a good idea, okay? So this is back when I was a doctoral student. I had two little boys. They were like 3 and 5 years old. And one of the things that would happen every day is they'd get into the minivan and they would argue over the seat. Both of them wanted to sit in the seat, closer to mom, but the baby was sitting in the other seat. So one of them had to go all the way to the back. And it was an argument every day. And so one day I was working on my program called Story Champs, and I was coming up with these stories, and I had written a story about this experience. And then they get in the van and they're, arguing about it. And instead of me turning around, yelling at them and saying, you sit here and you sit there, which is what I really wanted to do, right? I just calmly said, this one day, by the way, my kids are named Logan and Hudson, okay? And I said, one day, I said the name wrong. Hunter is the character's name. This little boy named Hunter, he was getting in the minivan with his brother to go to school. And his brother sat in the seat that Hunter wanted to sit in. And Hunter was like mad because he wanted to sit in that seat. And, my boys at this point, they're just like listening to me like, what are you doing? Right? And I'm just calmly telling them the story about Hunter. So Hunter, I go on with the story. I said, Hunter said calmly to his brother, hey, can I have a turn sitting in that seat? I really want to sit there. And the brother says, okay, no problem. Gets up and moves to the back of the seat. And my boys, I'm like, there's a moment of silence going, what's going to happen? My kids looked at each other. The one that was in the seat said, hey, it's okay. I'll get up. He moves. And he's like, here, you can sit in the seat. Moves to the back of the seat. And Hudson goes, hey, that story's like us. Sits in the seat. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that just happened. I turn around because they're behind me, right? And I turn around like this, yeah, Trina, that was a super mom move, right? That was my first experience using a story to handle this discipline, right? I was like, oh my gosh, these people have got something here. As American Indians, I'm going to learn this task. And so I have used those stories, right? I have used stories strategically for that purpose. Now, I'm sure the stories in your culture are more elaborate. You said involve magic or like spiritual kinds of things, which are great. Americans in our mainstream American culture, we generally don't. We're more active voice, right? We're all about the individual character, right? She mentioned that we're very individualistic. It's all action. In the stories from Spanish-speaking children, it's more passive and they focus on the emotions, where Americans focus on action, action, action. It's all what you're doing, right? And sometimes we'll talk about our feelings, but that's not the real motivator. It's the tragedy or the problem we're experiencing. But it's different for Hispanics. And most of the African-American children, they tell stories around a particular theme. It's like topic-centric is what it's called. So like they'll tell multiple stories around the same idea or topic. But when they get to school, that's how they tell the stories at home. When they get to school, guess what they do? They tell a very linear, action-focused story because that's the kind of storytelling that's taught in American schools. Okay. All right, so let me move on to these principles. I'm gonna have to go through fast if we're gonna see any videos. All right, multiple exemplars. Well, the point here is that we need to use more than one story to teach, okay? They need to see many examples to be able to learn the patterns of the stories. The patterns do not emerge when you repeat the same story over and over and over and over again. So on Monday, tell story A. On Tuesday, tell story B. On Wednesday, tell story C. After 10 or 20 stories, you can repeat the stories. But you don't want to tell the same stories over and over in consecutive sessions. So here's examples. Remember, the pattern is the character, problem, feeling, action, ending. That's what we're after. We want them to learn that pattern. So we got to give them multiple stories that have that pattern in them. So each of the illustrations represent a different story. And then the stories are written there, but you don't need to read them. That's the idea, is that the patterns are consistent in them. Now, storybooks are a great idea, but there's something to think about here. When we use oral stories that are kind of like created or found or made up by a teacher or a clinician, they're usually developmentally appropriate lengths for children's expressive language. So they may only be like 60 words, 60 to 100 words. They can be really short. And that's what we would expect young children or children with disabilities to be able to tell, right? A storybook it's too long for a child to tell or retell, and it may have structures or inconsistent structures. It may not even have the patterns that we're looking for, okay? Oral storytelling can facilitate both comprehension and production, whereas storybook reading really just promotes comprehension and vocabulary learning. So when we use oral stories, we can have rapid acquisition of those frames, right? Because they get more patterns, more exposures to the patterns. And when we use storybooks for language promotion, it's actually slow, very slow, and low impact on oral language skills. Even though reading books to kids is the primary oral language strategy that's recommended to parents and preschool or reception teachers all over the world, it is actually much slower than using oral storytelling. Okay. It's just another example. All right, we also, number 3 is to keep children active. Talking is necessary to get better at talking, and listening is necessary to get better at listening. So it's a mistake for the interventionist or the teacher to do all the talking, right? We need to talk so that the kids can talk, so that they know what to say. Right? Your job is to model, to prompt, to praise, and to recast the things that the children say, or like repeat what they're saying. All right, retelling is our primary method for doing this. We want to model a story and then have the child retell that story, right? That gives the child opportunities to talk, and then most of your attention is on getting that child to say the specific words, longer sentences, making sure they have all the parts, character, problem, feeling, action, ending, right? It's also very controlled for every child, and you can adapt and modify the story based on the learner that you have in front of you. Remember I said about the cognitive frames? When you retell, you're importing cognitive information and exporting it. So you're making use of those frames in that, stored in your cognition. Okay, it's definitely more effective than answering questions about stories. And research tells us that it improves literacy, receptive and expressive language skills, and comprehension, which is the reason why I'm telling you that this is a powerful tool. Cognitive psychologists and learning psychologists say the number one way to study, the most effective way to study for anything, like for an exam, is to retell somebody the content. Retelling, retelling, retelling. It's flexible and motivating. I'm going to skip a couple of these. Okay. So I skipped something that was minor. We just can use like group responding to get everybody to talk at once. That's all it was. We also want to use things like games to help kids be active. So sometimes when their friend is talking, we need to train kids to be able to listen to that person. Remember, it's not just about talking, it's also about listening. And so we've got to create ways for them to be engaged in listening. And so there's an intervention called response cards, right? The idea is there's note cards or signs, small whiteboards, etc., that students display so that the teacher can see that the child has made some sort of response. It's a comprehension. So remember when I taught you the gestures, it's a form of a response card. So if I was to tell you a story, I'm going to tell you one right now, and you guys play story gestures with me, okay? So I can model how this goes. So once there was a little boy named Johann. Very good. We got some characters there. And he was riding his bike down the rocky road, right? And his bike crashed. He hit a rock and he crashed. Great, that's our problem, right? And he felt sad because he cut his knee, right? He decided to run home and get his mom to help him. So he ran home. That's our action. And he said, "Mom, I need a Band-Aid. Look at my knee, got cut." After his mom put a Band-Aid on his knee, he felt better, right? And he was happy that he could go back outside and ride his bike, right? So I saw you guys all comprehend that story I just told, okay? So that is training to listen. And you can do it with other things. We're gonna show this video because this is fun. Okay. Went to the park and then what's happening here? He said it's Iraq. That's our character. Come on. That's our problem. Very good. Okay, keep going. Joseph, we're listening. His gesture. He doesn't have the sticks. All right, so you saw Joseph, this kid on the end, was telling the story. The friends were using the sticks that had the icons on them. And he actually used the gesture to help him because he doesn't have the sticks, he's the storyteller, right? So the gestures are a phenomenal tool because they help the kids themselves. It's something that's in their own body. Hold on, that's the same one. These videos are a little choppy. We did gestures, so I'm not going to show this video. But here's another one, peer tutoring. This is another way to engage kids actively, right? In this situation, it's a peer mediated where the kids take turns telling each other. Just like I did the think, pair, share, that was a peer mediated strategy. We can use that with children too. I should also say that what I'm talking about is scalable, not just for like these young kids in 3 to 5. Right? This works all the way up, but all of my videos are with little young children because they're the easiest to get permission to video record. That is logistics, okay? But we've done this work all the way up to like 5th grade, so. Anyway, so in this procedure, the kids actually take turns telling the story and they get opportunities to tell it individually. Okay, I do want to show this one. Hopefully my video is still up. During the partner retail. During the partner retail, I walk around to make sure that the kids can meet the additional support. Yeah, check that. She said you got a shot. And he said that's right. The jam ceremony finalizes this team spirit in the program. Okay, everybody. Okay, so you saw the kids kind of helping each other, telling that story independently, right? It gives them confidence. And my master's dissertation work was on the social benefits of peer tutoring. So not only is peer tutoring helpful for their academic or language, but they also tend to be better friends and kids learn how to work cooperatively together. So whole part, whole instruction. Basically, the gist here is that we want to give a meaningful context. I don't teach the icons separately. I don't teach, hey, every story has a character, let's talk about a character. We don't need to do that. Just put it in the story. They're going to repeatedly hear stories with characters in it. So it's a whole. We want to make it meaningful. And then we can practice the parts, but we always put it back together. Okay? So here's an example, is I might read a story and then name the parts, right? And then have the children retell each of the parts separately, and then I'm going to summarize the story again, bring it back to its whole. So I go like this, whole, part, whole, all the way through that little session, that teaching episode, because it makes it meaningful, breaks it down into something that they can do, right? And by the end of the session, the children are doing that individual retell or partner retell together, right? Because that's a more challenging skill to be able to do that on their own. Okay, visuals. Visuals can help, right? We want to support children in being able to tell the stories. So anything like photos, illustrations, videos, props, gestures, icons, right? But keep in mind that these kinds of visuals are just temporary prompts and that they shouldn't be left in. We need to fade them. So I always think about content-specific visuals, things that are more illustrative of a specific story, and then content-generic visuals that are showing the pattern. Remember, because what we're after is that big pattern. We need to show that as well as something that supports this specific story. Okay. So in this slide, I might start when the children are retelling a story on their own. I'm going to start with both the illustrations that show that specific story, so content specific, and the icons, so content generic. And then the first thing I fade is the content specific stuff, because I want them to use the less helpful visuals. And then the third time in that same session that a child retells that story, none of those visuals. So we need to fade them so they don't become dependent on those things. So think about any kind of visuals you use, even the gestures, any of those things, those are temporary and need to be faded so the children don't become prompt dependent. Okay, we have to provide important feedback. That's how children are going to learn to do better. Okay. So there are kind of three kinds of errors when a child is telling a story. They could say nothing, right? Like they don't know what to say next. Or they could skip something, like maybe they skip the feeling in a story. They said the character, the problem, went on to the action, so they can skip a piece. Or they could tell part of the story, but didn't use the complex language that we were wanting them to, right? As expected. Like maybe it's a vocabulary word we want them to use, or it's a temporal subordinate clause we want them to use, something like that. So these are three things that the interventionist needs to be watching out for, so that they can prompt these things. The feedback guidelines are really that you need to provide feedback immediately. It needs to be specific for what they're doing. So immediately, you'd say, wait, I'm a little confused. How did Martin feel about his problem? Don't wait till the end and say, well, I don't know how Martin felt, right? Because we're not taking advantage of the cohesion between those story elements if we wait. It needs to be specific. Rather than saying, oops, there's something missing, say, how did he feel about his problem? Okay. And we always want to make sure that we end with telling the child what it is they need to say or do. Okay. And then having them do it. So prompts are very similar to just the feedback, right? But here's how they're slightly different. If there's a preceding part of the story and the child makes one at type 2 or type 3 error. And type 2, remember, is that they skip the story or story element. They say they skip the feeling, or they didn't say the sentence the way you want them to say it. Then you are engaging in a correction procedure. However, if the child is not saying anything, like they don't know what comes next, there's no response for you to correct. You simply provide a prompt. But the prompt procedure is pretty much the same thing. But it happens before they engage in the response. Okay, so this is an example of a child who didn't use the complex sentence that I was targeting for her. Okay. Can you guys hear that okay? Yeah, I know the video was lagged there. The little girl said he fell or fell in the mud. And I said, here, say it like this. When he came down the slide, he fell in the mud puddle. And then I had that little girl repeat it. My sentence that I wanted her to say was much more complex, and it used a left branching temporal subordinate clause. That was the target for that child. You don't need to know what that is, but the idea is that it's a complex sentence. And you want to model it and then have them imitate it. But in this one, in this video, this little girl skips a part, right? And so I prompt, wait just a second, what is this? You know, something like that. And then she gives me the answer, but then it wasn't a complex sentence, so I do the other kind of prompt, right? So it's kind of like a two of them back to back.
All right, tell us about
Okay, this isn't working very well.
No. I was sad because I was all dirty. So those are feelings. Oh.
All right, I don't think that's working very well. I'm almost to the end. Let me look at my, yeah, I'm good on time now. So, no, what's happening there? All right, well, Tabo. Anyway, I'm going to tell you that the principle is actually that we differentiate and individualize, because we cannot always work with kids one-on-one, okay? We can't always work with kids one-on-one. We have to work with them in a whole class or in small groups. And so we need to be able to differentiate between learners, right? This kid might be able to do A, this kid might need to do B. We have different targets for them, okay? So when we are putting children together in a group, we want to group them based on the story structure we're teaching. Okay. I don't want to stop. We don't have time to stop. Are you guys okay with me moving along without using the visuals? Okay. So we want to group kids according to the story structure, but then individualize based on the words and sentences. Does that make sense? So if you put 4 kids in a group, they all should be working on character setting, problem filling, plan, action, ending, and feeling. The same story or discourse structure patterns. But then this one child could be working on using just 3-word utterances, right? Another child could be using an AAC device, right? Another one, we might be working on just maybe English verbs, right? Or emotions. We could have different targets for each one of those kids according to like vocabulary and sentence structures or modality, okay? So small group narrative intervention or oral storytelling is very efficient because we have a story and they all get a turn to tell it in whatever modality, in whatever form they can produce. And then the clinician or the educator's responsibility is to differentiate the expectations for each of those kids. All right, and we're to the next one. Arranging for generalization. I'm going to say for I have a couple of videos that I want to make sure we have time for. So generalization. Once we've taught these patterns, right? That's really what we're talking about. Using oral storytelling to teach patterns that are academically relevant and socially relevant. Then we've got to plan for what else are we going to use those patterns for? So here's a list of things that you can do. So once you have children retelling, we need to show them the icons or show them whatever visuals you're using and say, now tell a story, or you could say something like, has something like that ever happened to you, right? Ask them to talk about themselves, right? Or what's it like at your house when you do blank, right? So, or show them a picture in a magazine or a YouTube video and have them generate a story about what's going on. Okay, these are more complex, right? It's more challenging than retelling a story, but it's where we want them to go. Because in school, they've got to write stories. They've got to create them, right? Sometimes they're personal stories, sometimes they're fictional, they got to make them up, or they can draw from their own experiences. Okay, drawing, dictating, and writing. So we actually know from our research that kids do this naturally. They make the jump from oral storytelling to written storytelling on their own, right? But if we facilitate it, like, hey, on this page, right, in this little square, draw a picture about the character and the setting. And in this square, draw a picture of the problem. This square, draw a picture of the action or the feeling, the action and the ending, right? Then you're giving them kind of a graphic organizer to be able to organize their writing in a much more intentional way. Take-home telling. Oh, this is one of my favorites. You can send a story home with a child, and it could be a story that they practiced at school, right? If you did something in the class or in the clinic or in a therapy session, then you can send that story home with the child and then encourage them to tell mom, dad, grandma, brother, whatever. Storybook reading, I prefer to use as a generalization tool, not the primary instructional tool. So I would use oral storytelling because it's more efficient, more powerful, but then you want to generalize to more complex stories. And like, as you're reading a book, you could be like, who's the character? What problem does this character have? How do you think they feel about that? So then you're using the same language that you did during a narrative intervention to help them understand more complex linguistic structures that are present in storybook reading. Anytime, teachers, you should always be drawing attention to complex language and vocabulary, right? If a child uses a big word like extract, I go, wow, that's a really big word. Way to go. Let's talk about extract. Do you know what that means? You must. You just used it, right? And have a conversation about these big words. And use big words yourself. One of the mistakes educators do is we simplify our language sometimes too much. And then the kids are not exposed to this complex academic vocabulary or sentences. So I would recommend use the complex words and sentences and then repeat it in a simplified version. So you want to encourage children to recognize, identify, and define words that they don't know the meanings to, looking for clues in the stories to figure out what the meanings are. And then remember I started with problem solving and protection. We can use those story frames to be able to teach things like social emotional health and problem solving. Right. So make it fun. This is the last one. It's got to be fun. The natural consequence of telling stories is attention and approval. Okay, so think about that. It's not like getting like here you get this little prize or a Skittle for telling a story. No. The natural consequence is the attention that they get from their peers or their parents or their teachers. So integrate that and make the sessions fun. Right? You can use things like competition, variety, making sure the pace is quick, using very animated, emotions or gestures, and then make it personal and relevant to them, right? You want kids to say, that happened to me once. Oh, okay, good, tell me about that. That's perfect. The kids don't even know that they're learning. I got a story about this one. I have many stories about this particular one, but I'm gonna tell you this one. I was doing some work with a nearby school in Florida, and this was their first day that they were doing academic language interventions after school. So they had selected a number of kids who had low language skills or not performing in reading and writing, and that they were going to do an extra 30 minutes of intervention after school. So all of the teachers had kids that they had recommended for this, and then I had trained the teachers. And one of the teachers, before she got started, she says, this kid in my classroom, he really struggles. He got assigned to this other group. Can I have him in my group? I'm worried he's got behavior problems. He's never engaged in lessons, stuff like that. I said, no problem. We put that kid in that group. After her 30-minute lesson, she comes to me, she goes, Trina, oh my gosh, I've got to tell you what happened. So this kid who's normally really engages in a lot of challenging behaviors when he's doing instruction, he probably has difficulties. So engages in problem behavior to get away from it, avoid it. So he's doing the lesson, the Story Champs lesson with his teacher. And at the end, he leans over and whispers to his teacher and says, hey, if you want to keep playing this game tomorrow and the next day, I won't tell anyone. That kid was engaged 100% in that lesson, and he did not even notice that he was engaged in instruction. The teacher was like, oh my goodness, where has this been my whole life? right? Because this is a kid, she has had difficulty reaching. That's how motivating storytelling is, right? I have another one, sorry, this is good. Little preschooler, I'm actually doing an assessment with her, collecting her story retell. And actually what I was doing is getting her to generate her own story. So we were just chit-chatting, I was like, okay, tell me a story about that. Back and forth, and I had recorded her story. We went the whole thing. I said, okay, you can go back to class now. And she goes, wait, I thought we had to do some activity. It's like, you just did it, right? I was like, completely didn't even realize that she was doing the assessment, right? Because it was storytelling. It was fun. It was engaged. It was natural. It was relevant, right? It was so easy to do. Wouldn't we use oral storytelling? I really want to show this picture or this video. Let me ask this question. Would you like me to talk about adaptations to AAC users or to simplify it? Or would you like to see a video from beginning to end, like a 10-minute session? What? Okay, we have an AAC. Yeah? Okay. These videos, by the way, are available on my website, so you can see them later. You can also YouTube Story Champs and find a ton. We have a Vimeo page or my personal website, trinastoolbox.com. There's a ton of resources there, and those videos that I want to show you are actually linked, okay? So let's talk about the prerequisite skills for doing this kind of storytelling interaction, because some of you may be working with kids with more significant complex communication needs, right? The first thing is you want to make sure that the kids you're working with can already make requests, whether or not that's through speech or AAC. If they are consistently using their devices or their speech to make requests, they get their wants and needs met, they may be a good candidate for doing oral storytelling. They also have to have a pretty good receptive language repertoire. So the children should be able to point to objects or pictures when asked and perform kind of actions based on spoken instruction, right? So if they don't have these things, these are the things that you would want to work on before you get to storytelling, okay? And then the last thing is they need to have some expressive language. They should be able to consistently use speech or AAC to describe or label objects and pictures using just at least one word or one symbol, right? They don't have to use complete sentences because you can get a lot of storytelling done with, 1 or 2, 3 words, right? But they have to have some expressive language to be able to graduate to the point where they can retell a story. Now, just because not all of your learners are going to be ready for storytelling themselves doesn't mean they can't benefit from it, okay? So I'm going to go to this bottom part. If they're not ready for storytelling, children can do other things in the same context. So let's say you've got a small group of children, maybe 3 kids, and one kid is really ready to do storytelling, but the other 2 are probably don't have those prerequisite skills. They can still be engaged in that storytelling interaction, but from the comprehension side, right? So you could do things like they could point to the icons, they could make the gestures as you're telling the story or as their peer is telling the story. They could also sequence pictures. So let's say you give them a stack of pictures and they put the pictures in order as you're telling the story, right? They might not be able to speak or use AAC to tell the story, but they could do something like that, possibly. You could also have them answer WH questions, right? Who was the story about? They could press something like boy, right? How did he feel? Sad, right? So they could answer the WH questions better than they could retell the whole story. So don't count them out if they don't have all those 3 prerequisite skills. You could also just teach them how to label, like using noun like boy for the character, right? For the setting, could be home, school. So you could be teaching what's in their device, if they're an AAC user, the symbols, right? Having them simply describe the parts of the story using 1 or 2 word symbol combos. Also emotions, like kids with autism, we need to work on emotions. Sometimes we use like flashcards and we just see a single scene. The problem is that's out of context. We don't know what preceded it. What was the problem? Why would they feel that? And that's actually more important for kids with autism because it builds that inferencing and theory of mind. All right, and then of course, just combining 2 to 3 words to form a sentence to describe each picture. You can simplify it there. Now, the AAC one, I'm going to give you the caveat. because that's the reason why I'm here, right? That's the other reason why I chose to work with Kirsten is because we've got to figure this out. And this is actually what we're working on and developing some research around this thing. So I'm giving you some current best recommendations naively, right? We don't know for sure that these are the best ones, but I'm going to give you what I believe is going to be the best recommendations right now. In the US, there are many, many speech language pathologists who use oral narration with children who are AAC users. And they adapt, right? And sometimes I learn from them. So they're telling me things like this. So I would recommend reading the entire story first so that the children hear the complete story. Remember, they need the whole story to make it meaningful. And they need to hear the complex language, okay? But then when it's the child's turn to retell, model what the child should be using, like using the child's device or core board, using aided modeling, all right? And then if you're expecting a response from that child for them to imitate, you provide whatever prompting is appropriate for that child. Maybe an expectant look is sufficient, but maybe you need to provide a little bit of physical support, okay? But make sure it's as needed. And as they are touching the symbols, you're saying the words. You're saying the complex language that goes with it, okay? And you might want to just start with one symbol per story part, one word, one symbol for character, one symbol for problem, one symbol for feeling. See what I mean? And then you can build multiple symbol combos as they get more proficient. So that's the best recommendation I have for you right now. But this has not been solved, but it's on Kirsten and me to do. That's all right. I take the challenge. Okay. Okay, we have time for this. This is really our conclusion. I want you to think about what did you learn today about oral storytelling that you can apply in your practice, in your classroom, in your speech language interventions. Okay? Take a minute to think about it, and then turn and tell your neighbor or your partner. Okay. I'll give you 2 minutes, and then we're done. What did you guys learn today? Good. Okay, are we okay if we just take a couple minutes I want to hear some of the things you guys learned that you can use in your practice. Maybe like 3 people tell me something that you learned. Anybody feel comfortable sharing? All right, either that or you didn't learn anything. But I don't know. Is that true? Was it overwhelming? Okay. So somebody tell me something that they learned before I start crying. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
I really do a lot of simple stories with them to get story retelling and work on vocabulary and using an AC device where the vocabulary is there. So I think it's just been reinforcing because sometimes you feel like you're working in the dark. Yeah. So it's been really reinforcing that aspect. And I think one of the things that I was just thinking about as you were speaking is I have a boy that I see for maybe I was 11, with 5 intellectual disability. And just how to things like writing stories, we do a lot of social stories, behavior management, as you mentioned earlier. But I think I was just thinking about it in terms of how do we extend his vocabularies. He has a special interest in art animals. But we both seem to become interested in platforms as well, so that we're more functional. So I think it's just really inspiration in terms of providing some structure. So kind of things like that really happening in capacity, or maybe not capacity, but it feels like there wasn't really a structure, and I love structure. So this is really
Thank you. I just appreciate you sharing something positive that you learned today. I appreciate it. Anyone else? Please share. Oh, there's a question.
There's a question on YouTube.
Okay, we can do it louder.
So Priya, there's just a question from Cookie on YouTube. She says, so I think it's related probably to the videos that you were playing in terms of the intervention. And she asks, are the kids reading for fun, or do you actually teach them tenses, or explain reading on different words and paragraphs?
Yes. Okay. So are the children reading for fun? Do I work on tenses and explain the meaning of vocabulary words? Okay, that was the question. Okay, the first one is in our stories or in our storytelling intervention, there is no reading. The children are not doing the reading. We're doing it outside of a reading session, but in the US, we do this like walk to read kind of idea where it's like decoding instruction. Well, I like to call this walk to talk. So like we scoop up some kids in the building and we make a group out of them, but it's talking, not reading. And remember at the beginning, I said there's a reason for that because the kids are at very disparate levels in terms of their decoding, and we don't want their decoding to drive their comprehension because language skills and decoding skills could be like totally like this. Like it's rare when kids are like right balanced, right? So we want to remove the decoding piece of it in the intervention and practice this oral exchange, right? Because the oral exchange transfers to reading and writing naturally, right? Okay, so that's the first piece. The second piece about tenses, absolutely, I work on tenses all the time, but in an oral language modality. So we even have research. I worked with a child who was an English language learner, and she had a really difficult time with like tenses. And so when we do the stories, most of the stories are told in past tense, okay? Because it's kind of like an event that already happened, right? And so we would model it. If, let's say, the child didn't use the correct tense, you can do 2 things. You could stop them and say, here, say it like this, and model, like, he walked to the store. Now you say that, right? That's one way to do it. The second way is if the child is a little timid, maybe not ready, or can handle the prompt, the child says, maybe walk, or, incorrectly does the tense, I could recast it correctly. Right, I can repeat and say, oh yeah, he walked to the store, and emphasizing the part that they missed, right? So providing an extra model of that particular linguistic feature that I want the child to know. And eventually I am gonna have them do it or imitate me, right? But not all kids are ready and capable of that. And you don't wanna over prompt. Like some kids just starting out, they may just trying to get the parts of the story. I don't want to throw at them vocabulary and complex sentences at the same time. So you want to do these things kind of gradually as they master the story structure, then I can fold in vocabulary, fold in complex sentences, and grammar and syntax targets. Okay. The third part of the question was vocabulary. And the answer is yes, when they're ready, right? So when we create stories, I create stories for this purpose, right? And you can create stories. Now you know what the patterns are. You need to adapt the patterns for the culture that's relevant to your children and for the purpose, right? My stories are very academic. We want them to have academic language. That's not to teach morals per se. They're to teach things that go on in schools and in social situations. By the way, all of my stories that we use are relevant to young kids. Like they're what we call personally relevant, right? They're not a fantasy story. And that's because we want kids to be able to relate to them and use the vocabulary in their own lives. So back to the vocabulary. If you create a story, you can put complex vocabulary in the story and intentionally stop and define it when you're doing the instruction. Or you can leave the vocabulary out and just do a really simple story because that's not what you're targeting yet. But if you want the kids to learn additional complex vocabulary, we call them sparkle words, by the way, call them sparkle words because they add sparkle to it. Instead of run, it might be trot or gallop, right? We can replace simple words with more complex words and be like, what do you think that means? Gallop, right? Listen to the story again. What do you think this means? So we teach children to listen for clues within the story to figure out the meaning of the word. And then when they've attempted to do that, then we would say, yeah, gallop means to run. It's like a fun way to run, right? And horses gallop. Have you ever ridden a horse and galloped that horse? Right? So then you make meaning out of that particular word from that story context. And when you've had that small exchange about the word and the definition, then you go back to the storytelling piece, right? And then when it's their turn to tell the story, if they use the word run instead of gallop, I'd say, wait just a second, use our sparkle word, right? He galloped across the field. You say that, right? So we want them to not only know the definitions, but also to use the words in the storytelling exchange. Is that good? Good. All right, any other questions? Okay, I think I'm done. You can get more information. The videos are at trinastoolbox.com. Lots of other free resources there. And at Language Dynamics Group also, there's a lot of information and research and videos. And then you can follow me on social media if you want.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Trina, for that very inspiring talk. I am very inspired to tell more stories when I lecture. And yeah, I think you just showed us how powerful stories really are on a social level, on an emotional level, on an identity formation level, and then also for language acquisition, for language intervention. So I'm sure all of us got some tools that we can take into our practice. So yeah, so thank you very much for you as an audience. You've been amazing. It's been wonderful that you've been so interactive, telling some of your stories. We've really enjoyed that. Before you run off to your other life and your responsibilities this afternoon, may I please ask all of us to just gather at the pond with, I think it's just there at the entrance, for a photo. We are going to have a visual reminder of what happened today, of our story today. So we would just really like to take a photo of everybody that's been here. Other than that, thank you very much. We really enjoyed having you here. And until we meet again, thank you.